72-year-old Beatrice lowered her trembling hands to the searing asphalt, the cold steel of police handcuffs biting ruthlessly into her fragile wrists. Above her stood a rookie patrolman, his hand resting casually on his holster, blind to the catastrophic mistake he had just made. He thought he had caught a car thief. He thought he was in total control of the narrative. He had absolutely no idea that the routine radio call he just made was about to bring the entire county's police force crashing down on his head. The morning sun had just begun to bake the pristine suburban streets of Marietta, Georgia, casting long golden shadows across the meticulously manicured lawns of the Oak Creek neighborhood. For Beatrice Washington, a 72-year-old retired high school history teacher, Tuesday mornings were sacred. They were a quiet, unyielding routine, carved out of the chaotic tapestry of her long life, a day dedicated to simple pleasures and the preservation of cherished memories. Beatrice stood before the hallway mirror, meticulously adjusting the collar of her crisp, eggshell white blouse. She pinned a delicate pearl brooch to her lapel, a gift from her late husband, Thomas, for their 30th wedding anniversary. Her silver hair was styled in an elegant, sweeping bob, and despite the gentle web of wrinkles framing her warm, amber eyes, she possessed an undeniable posture of grace and authority. For 35 years, that posture had commanded the respect of thousands of unruly teenagers in her classroom. Today, it was simply how she faced the world. Stepping out into the humid Georgia air, Beatrice smiled as her eyes landed on the crown jewel of her driveway, a pristine, fully restored 1972 Mercedes-Benz 280 SE in a rich, gleaming tobacco brown. The classic car was a masterpiece of mid-century German engineering, but to Beatrice it was a time machine. Thomas had purchased it brand new, working overtime at the manufacturing plant to afford the luxury sedan. It was the car they had driven down the coast for their second honeymoon. The car they had used to bring their children, and later their foster children, home. Since Thomas's passing 5 years ago, keeping the chrome polished and the leather conditioned had become Beatrice's weekly devotion. She slid into the driver's seat, the heavy door closing with a satisfying, vault-like thud. The engine roared to life with a deep, throaty purr, smoothing out into a quiet hum. Beatrice adjusted her tortoise-shell sunglasses and backed out of the driveway, heading toward the upscale fresh market on Roswell Road to purchase the ingredients for her famous peach cobbler. A few miles away, Officer Todd Harrison was nursing a lukewarm cup of gas station coffee in his patrol cruiser, his fingers drumming impatiently against the steering wheel. At 26, Harrison was 3 months into his transfer to the Marietta precinct, from a sleepy, rural county where the most exciting call of the week was usually a noise complaint or a stray dog. He was ambitious, deeply insecure, and dangerously eager to prove himself to the veteran officers who often dismissed him as a greenhorn. Harrison had a habit of seeing threats where there were none, a byproduct of too many tactical training podcasts and a desperate desire to make a hero collar. His radio crackled with a bolo, "Be on the lookout," for a stolen vintage vehicle from a neighboring jurisdiction. The dispatcher's voice was tinny and hurried. "Be advised, looking for a 1970s model brown sedan, reported stolen out of Fulton County. Suspect is armed. Use caution." Harrison sat up straighter, his pulse quickening. A stolen vintage brown sedan. It was a vague description, no make, no model, no license plate provided in the initial burst, but to Harrison it was an invitation. 10 minutes later, Harrison was cruising through the bustling parking lot of the fresh market when the sunlight caught the blinding reflection of a polished chrome bumper. His eyes locked onto the tobacco brown 1972 Mercedes-Benz 280 SE, parked flawlessly in a space near the entrance. The car was immaculate, and it was a brown, 1970s model sedan. Harrison's heart hammered against his ribs. This is it, he thought, pulling his cruiser into the aisle and throwing it into park, effectively blocking the classic car from reversing. He didn't bother to run the plates. He didn't bother to call it in to confirm the make and model of the stolen vehicle, which, had he checked, was actually a rusted 1978 Chevrolet Malibu. Adrenaline had already hijacked his critical thinking. He was going to make this bust, and he was going to do it by the book. His book. Inside the grocery store, Beatrice was at the checkout lane, chatting amiably with the cashier, a bright-eyed college student named Lily. "Making the cobbler again, Mrs. Washington?" Lily asked, carefully bagging the fresh Georgia peaches, a sack of pure cane sugar, and a carton of heavy cream. "You know it, sweetheart." Beatrice smiled, her voice a soothing, melodic alto. "My boy is coming into town this afternoon. He works entirely too hard, and the least I can do is make sure he has something sweet waiting for him when he gets off the clock." "He's lucky to have you," Lily said, handing over the receipt. Beatrice took her canvas tote bags, carefully balancing them as she walked out of the sliding glass doors into the blinding midday heat. She took a deep breath, enjoying the aroma of the nearby bakery, and began the short walk to her car. She noticed the police cruiser idling behind her Mercedes immediately. Its light bar wasn't flashing, but its aggressive positioning was unmistakable. Beatrice felt a mild flutter of confusion, but no fear. She was a respected elder in her community, a woman who had spent decades shaping the minds of local youth. She assumed the officer was simply waiting for someone or had parked haphazardly to run inside. As she approached the trunk of her car, digging into her purse for her silver keys, the driver's side door of the patrol car flew open. "Step away from the vehicle." The voice was loud, sharp, and laced with an authority that bordered on frantic. Beatrice turned, her brow furrowing in genuine bewilderment. Officer Todd Harrison was storming toward her, his hand resting ominously on the butt of his service weapon. His mirrored sunglasses hid his eyes, but his jaw was clenched so tight it looked ready to snap. "Officer?" Beatrice asked, her tone calm, the same tone she used to de-escalate fights in the high school cafeteria. "Is there a problem?" "I said step away from the car, ma'am. Put the bags down and step onto the sidewalk," Harrison barked, closing the distance between them. Beatrice blinked, looking from the young officer to her pristine Mercedes, and back again. "I'm sorry. There must be some sort of misunderstanding. This is my vehicle. I'm just trying to load my groceries." Harrison sneered, his chest puffing out beneath his tactical vest. He looked at the elderly black woman standing before him, pearls, pressed slacks, and silver hair, and his biased, adrenaline-fueled brain simply refused to compute the scene. In his mind, the bolo was absolute, a vintage brown car, a high-value theft. He didn't see a retired teacher. He saw a suspect trying to play him for a fool. "Right, and I'm the mayor," Harrison snapped. "I'm not going to tell you again. Drop the bags, turn around, and place your hands on the trunk of the car." Beatrice's polite confusion began to curdle into indignation. She had lived through the civil rights movement in the Deep South. She knew the sting of profiling, knew the ugly, jagged edge of authority wielded by frightened, arrogant young men. But she also knew her rights, and she knew she was doing nothing wrong. "Young man," Beatrice said, her voice dropping an octave, carrying the weight of absolute authority. "My name is Beatrice Washington. My registration is in the glove compartment, and my identification is right here in my purse. If you will allow me to show you—" "Do not reach into that bag!" Harrison yelled, his voice cracking slightly as he unclipped the holster of his taser, his mind flashing to the dispatcher's warning. "Suspect is armed." "I am reaching for my driver's license," Beatrice stated firmly, her hand hovering over the open zipper of her leather handbag. "I said keep your hands where I can see them." Harrison surged forward. The restraint he was supposed to have learned in the academy vanished in a flash of ego and fear. He didn't see a 72-year-old grandmother. He saw defiance. Without another word of warning, Harrison lunged. He grabbed Beatrice's left wrist with brutal force, twisting her arm behind her back. The canvas grocery bags slipped from Beatrice's grasp. They hit the asphalt with a sickening crack. The glass jar of vanilla extract shattered, sending a dark, fragrant puddle spreading across the hot pavement. Perfectly ripe peaches bruised and rolled under the tires of the Mercedes. "What are you doing? You're hurting me!" Beatrice cried out, a sharp jolt of pain shooting through her arthritic shoulder. The sheer physical shock of the assault stole her breath. "Stop resisting! Stop resisting!" Harrison shouted, a mantra used to justify the violence of the moment. He shoved her forward, slamming her chest and face against the burning hot metal of the Mercedes's trunk. The heat of the metal seared through Beatrice's thin blouse. The pearl brooch, the gift from Thomas, dug painfully into her collarbone, the pin snapping under the pressure of the officer's weight. The heavy metallic click-clack of the handcuffs locking into place echoed in the sudden, horrifying silence of the parking lot. Beatrice gasped for air, the wind knocked out of her by the forceful shove against the trunk. Her shoulder screamed in agony. The joint strained far past its natural limit by Harrison's aggressive hold. "I am not resisting," Beatrice breathed out, her voice shaking now. Not from fear, but from a profound, agonizing physical pain and a rising tide of righteous fury. "You are making a terrible mistake, officer." "Save it for the judge," Harrison sneered, patting her down roughly, his hands clumsily searching her pockets. He wrenched her away from the car, spinning her around to face him. Beatrice stood there, her hands pinned helplessly behind her back, her posture bent from the pain in her shoulder. Her beautiful white blouse was smudged with dirt from the exterior of the car, and a thin scrape on her cheek was beginning to redden where her face had met the hot trunk. By now, the commotion had drawn the attention of the bustling shopping center. Shoppers stopped with their carts in the crosswalks. Pedestrians froze on the sidewalks. Sarah Jenkins, the general manager of the fresh market, had just stepped out for her lunch break. She was a fiercely protective woman who had known Beatrice for a decade. Seeing the elderly woman in handcuffs, Sarah dropped her sandwich wrapper and sprinted across the asphalt. "Hey, what the hell do you think you're doing?" Sarah screamed, her voice piercing the ambient noise of the parking lot. "Take your hands off of her!" Harrison whipped his head around, his hand flying back to his taser. Back up right now, or you will be arrested for interfering with a police investigation." "Investigation?" Sarah scoffed, stopping a few feet away, her eyes wide with disbelief as she looked at Beatrice's pained expression. "That is Mrs. Washington. She's a retired school teacher. She buys groceries here every Tuesday. What is wrong with you?" "She's in possession of a stolen vehicle," Harrison declared loudly, puffing out his chest, trying to project absolute authority to the growing crowd. "Now step back." "Stolen?" Beatrice managed to say, her voice regaining a fraction of its usual steel. "That car has belonged to my family since 1972. My husband bought it at the dealership in Atlanta. The license plate reads BEA 72. If you would just open your eyes and run the plate, you foolish boy, you would see that." Harrison's face flushed a deep, ugly crimson. He hated being challenged, and he absolutely loathed being spoken down to, especially in front of an audience. The crowd was swelling now. At least a dozen people had formed a semicircle around the vehicles. Among them was Greg Miller, a 30-something local real estate agent. Recognizing the escalating danger of the situation, Greg silently pulled his smartphone from his pocket, swiped to the camera, and hit record. The little red dot began to blink, capturing the scene in high definition. "I run the investigation here, ma'am, not you," Harrison spat at Beatrice, deliberately ignoring her perfectly logical request to check the license plate. In his mind, backing down now, checking the plate and realizing he was wrong, would be a public humiliation. He had already gone hands-on. He had already used force. He had to be right. "Officer," Greg spoke up from the crowd, holding his phone steady. "You need to de-escalate. You've got a senior citizen in handcuffs over what is obviously a misunderstanding. Run the plate. Just run the plate, man." "I am issuing a lawful order for this crowd to disperse," Harrison yelled, his voice pitching higher in a mild panic. He realized he was surrounded. He realized people were filming. But rather than reassess his actions, he doubled down, retreating into the fortress of his badge. He grabbed Beatrice by the bicep, his fingers digging into her fragile skin, and forcefully dragged her toward his cruiser. "Please!" Beatrice winced, stumbling slightly in her sensible leather loafers. "My shoulder. I have arthritis. You are hurting me." "Then you should have thought about that before you stole a car," Harrison muttered, opening the rear door of his cruiser. "She didn't steal a car, you idiot!" Sarah Jenkins screamed, stepping forward again, tears of frustration springing to her eyes. "Her husband bought it for her. Half the town knows that car. Let her go." "One more warning." Harrison pointed a shaking finger at Sarah. "Or you're going in the back of a squad car, too." Harrison forced Beatrice into the back of the sweltering patrol cruiser. The heavy fiberglass seat offered no comfort, and with her hands cuffed behind her back, Beatrice was forced to sit at an awkward, agonizing angle, her knees pressed against the metal grate that separated the front and rear of the vehicle. The door slammed shut, sealing her in the stifling, airless space. The Georgia heat inside the unair-conditioned back seat immediately began to rise. Outside, the crowd was on the verge of a boiling point. Greg stepped closer, his camera trained on Harrison's badge number and nameplate. "You're making a massive mistake, Officer Harrison," Greg said clearly, making sure the audio picked up his exact words. "You have detained a prominent community member without verifying her identity or the vehicle's registration. We are all witnessing this." Harrison felt a bead of sweat roll down his spine. The situation was slipping out of his control. He needed backup. He needed the cavalry to come and validate his authority, to push this crowd back so he could process his arrest in peace. He stormed around to the driver's side of his cruiser, yanked the door open, and grabbed his radio mic. "Dispatch, this is Unit 4, Bravo." Harrison breathed heavily into the microphone, trying to sound tactical and in command. "I have a 1015. Suspect is detained in the rear of my vehicle. I need at least 2 additional units for crowd control at the Fresh Market on Roswell Road. The public is becoming hostile and interfering with my scene." 5 miles away, at the Oak Creek County Dispatch Center, the atmosphere was a low hum of ringing phones and radio chatter. Brenda Collins, a veteran dispatcher with 20 years on the headset, caught Unit 4 Bravo's call. She frowned at her screen. Unit 4 Bravo was Harrison. Brenda had privately noted for weeks that Harrison was a lawsuit waiting to happen. "Copy, 4 Bravo," Brenda replied, her fingers flying across her keyboard to dispatch the backup units. "What is the nature of the arrest? Do you have the suspect's information?" Back at the Fresh Market, Harrison leaned against his cruiser, glaring at the crowd while keeping the radio pressed to his mouth. "Suspect is in custody for the Grand Theft Auto Bolo out of Fulton County, the vintage brown sedan." Brenda paused. She pulled up the Bolo logs from the morning. 4 Bravo, confirm the make and model of the recovered vehicle. The Bolo was for a 1978 Chevy Malibu. A cold, icy dread suddenly dropped into the pit of Harrison's stomach. Chevy Malibu? He turned his head slowly, looking past the shattered jar of vanilla extract and the crushed peaches on the pavement, locking his eyes onto the immaculate rear end of the brown car. The silver lettering on the trunk lid gleamed in the sun. 280 SE. Right above it, the three-pointed star of Mercedes-Benz. Harrison swallowed hard. The spit in his mouth tasted like copper. He looked down at the license plate. Just as the old woman had said, it read, BA-72. Dispatch, Harrison stammered, his voice losing all its previous bravado. Vehicle is it's a Mercedes-Benz, 1972. In the dispatch center, Brenda closed her eyes and let out a long, heavy sigh. 4 Bravo. Run the plate. Plate is Bravo Echo Alpha, -72, Harrison read off, his voice barely above a whisper. Brenda typed the characters into the NCIC database. The return was instantaneous. Registered owner, Beatrice Washington. No warrants, no flags. Vehicle status, clean. Brenda's blood went cold. She didn't just know the name Beatrice Washington. Everyone in the Marietta precinct knew that name. More importantly, everyone knew who Beatrice Washington's son was. 4 Bravo, Brenda said, her voice dropping into a deadly serious, flat tone that made the hairs on the back of the neck stand up. Confirm you have the registered owner, Beatrice Washington, in custody. I have an elderly black female in cuffs, yes, Harrison replied, sweat now pouring freely down his face. Brenda didn't respond to him. She muted her microphone and ripped her headset off. She stood up so fast her rolling chair slammed into the desk behind her. Brenda, what's going on? Asked the shift supervisor. Harrison just hooked up the chief's mother, Brenda said, her face pale. The supervisor's jaw dropped. Are you kidding me? He has her cuffed in the back of his cruiser at the Fresh Market. He thought her Mercedes was the stolen Malibu from Fulton. Without another word, Brenda sprinted out of the dispatch room, speed-walking down the linoleum hallway toward the executive offices. She burst through the heavy glass doors of the chief's suite, startling his administrative assistant. I need to see him right now, Brenda said, already pushing past the desk. Inside his office, Chief Arthur Mitchell was leaning over a massive city map, a cold cup of black coffee in his hand. At 44, Arthur was an imposing figure. He stood 6'3", with broad shoulders built from years of high school football and police academy training. He wore the 4 gold stars of the Chief of Police on his immaculate uniform collar, a testament to a brutal 20-year climb through the ranks. But Arthur Mitchell's life hadn't started in a tailored uniform. 30 years ago, he was a 14-year-old kid bouncing around the merciless foster care system, angry, abandoned, and 1 strike away from juvenile detention. Then he was placed in the home of Thomas and Beatrice Washington. Beatrice hadn't just given him a bed. She had given him a life. She had sat up with him through nightmares, tutored him through math tests, and taught him that his life had unshakable value. When he decided to keep his birth surname, Mitchell, out of respect for his late biological mother, Beatrice had simply kissed his forehead and said, "A name is just a word, Arthur. You are my son in every way that matters." Arthur looked up as Brenda burst into his office, her face flushed red. "Brenda, everything all right?" Arthur asked, setting his coffee down, instantly alert. "Chief," Brenda panted, gripping the doorframe. "It's Beatrice. It's your mother." Arthur's blood pressure spiked. He moved around the desk in a flash. "Did she have a heart attack? Was there a crash? Where is she?" "She's at the Fresh Market on Roswell." Brenda swallowed hard. "Chief, she's not hurt." "Well, I don't know if she's hurt, but she's in handcuffs." Arthur stopped dead in his tracks. The silence in the office was deafening. "What did you just say?" "Officer Harrison," Brenda explained rapidly, the words tumbling out. "He confused her car with a bolo for a stolen Chevy out of Fulton." He went hands-on. He has her cuffed in the back of his cruiser right now. He called for crowd control because the bystanders are getting hostile. The transformation in Arthur Mitchell was terrifying to behold. The calm, political demeanor of the chief of police vanished, replaced instantly by the primal, furious energy of a fiercely protective son. His eyes, usually warm and calculating, went dead and dark. He didn't grab his hat. He didn't say a word to Brenda. Arthur bolted out of his office. He moved down the hallway with such speed and intensity that officers instinctively flattened themselves against the walls to get out of his way. He slammed through the precinct's back exit, stepping into the glaring sunlight of the private motor pool. He bypassed his unmarked SUV and walked straight toward a fully marked, black and white Interceptor. He threw the door open, keyed the ignition, and slammed his hand onto the emergency light console. The light bar erupted in a blinding strobe of red and blue. Before the heavy bay gates had fully opened, Arthur floored the accelerator. The Interceptor's tires shrieked against the concrete, leaving thick black streaks as the massive vehicle fishtailed out onto the main avenue. Inside the cruiser, Arthur grabbed the radio. "Dispatch, this is Chief Mitchell. All units responding to the 4 Bravo assist at Fresh Market are to stand down. I am taking this call. I am less than 3 minutes out." "Copy, Chief." Brenda's voice came back, tight and nervous. Arthur gripped the steering wheel so hard his knuckles turned white. His jaw was locked tight, a muscle ticking violently in his cheek. The sirens wailed, parting the Marietta traffic like the Red Sea. In his mind, he was seeing his 72-year-old mother, the woman who had baked him peach cobblers, the woman who had pinned his first badge on his chest, sitting terrified in the back of a sweltering police car. Back at the Fresh Market, the situation was deteriorating rapidly. The crowd had grown to over 30 people. Some were shouting, others were filming. Greg Miller had stepped right up to the edge of the bumper. "Open the windows, man," Greg shouted at Harrison. "It's 90 degrees out here. You're going to give her a heat stroke." Inside the car, Beatrice closed her eyes, leaning her head back against the glass. Sweat beaded on her forehead. Her shoulder throbbed with a dull, sickening rhythm. She focused on her breathing, refusing to let the arrogant young officer see her cry. "Thomas," she thought to herself, "give me strength. Just give me strength to endure this fool." Harrison paced nervously by the driver's door, wiping sweat from his brow. He looked down the street, desperate for the sight of backup cruisers. He had realized his mistake, but his ego was too fragile to backtrack. He was trapped in his own web of authority. If he let her go now, the crowd would know they won. He would look weak. He decided to wait for a sergeant to arrive and make the call to release her. Suddenly, the piercing wail of a high-low siren echoed off the brick facades of the shopping center. The crowd turned. Harrison let out a breath of immense relief. Backup was here. A black and white police interceptor tore into the parking lot, hitting the speed bump so fast all 4 tires left the ground for a fraction of a second. It didn't park neatly in a spot. It slammed on its brakes, sliding to a dramatic angled halt just inches from Harrison's front bumper, blocking him in completely. The siren was killed, but the light bar continued to flash aggressively, painting the tense faces of the crowd in rapid flashes of red and blue. Harrison stood up straight, adjusting his duty belt, expecting to see a sympathetic sergeant step out to help him control the mob. Instead, the driver's side door of the Interceptor flew open, and out stepped a massive figure wearing a crisp white shirt with 4 gold stars gleaming on the collar. The crowd fell instantly, completely silent. Even the people filming lowered their phones slightly in shock. They all knew the chief of police. Officer Todd Harrison felt the blood drain from his face, pooling heavily in his boots. His knees went weak. The county police chief was here, at a routine grand theft auto call. Chief Arthur Mitchell didn't look at the crowd. He didn't look at the shattered groceries. He locked eyes with Officer Harrison, and the look in the chief's eyes was the promise of absolute, unmitigated hell. The sweltering afternoon heat seemed to evaporate, replaced by a chilling, suffocating silence that descended upon the Fresh Market parking lot. Not a single car engine revved. Not a single shopping cart rattled. The only sound was the heavy, rhythmic thud of Chief Arthur Mitchell's polished boots striking the asphalt as he marched toward Officer Todd Harrison. Arthur's face was an impenetrable mask of granite, but his dark eyes were blazing with a barely contained inferno. He bypassed the crushed peaches and the pungent pool of vanilla extract, his gaze fixed solely on the terrified rookie. Harrison instinctively snapped to attention, his hand rising in a shaky, half-hearted salute. "Chief Mitchell, sir. I wasn't expecting—" "The keys," Arthur interrupted. His voice wasn't a yell. It was a low, guttural growl that reverberated in the hollow of Harrison's chest. It was the voice of a man holding back an avalanche by a single thread. "Sir," Harrison squeaked, a bead of sweat dripping off his nose. "I have the suspect secured. It's a 10:15 on a stolen vehicle bolo out of—" Arthur didn't ask a second time. He stepped directly into Harrison's personal space, towering over the younger man by 4 inches. He reached down, grabbed the carabiner clipped to Harrison's duty belt, and ripped the patrol car keys away with such sudden violence that the metal ring snapped. Harrison gasped, stumbling back a step. The crowd watched in stunned fascination. Arthur turned his back on the trembling officer and strode to the rear door of the patrol cruiser. He jammed the key into the lock, twisting it sharply, and yanked the heavy door open. A wave of stifling, superheated air rolled out of the cabin, hitting Arthur in the face. Inside, Beatrice Washington sat awkwardly on the hard fiberglass bench, her head bowed, her breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. The white fabric of her blouse was soaked in sweat. When she heard the door open, she slowly lifted her head, her amber eyes squinting against the harsh glare of the sun. When she saw the 4 gold stars on the collar, and then the familiar, anguished face of the man wearing them, her stoic facade finally cracked. A single tear escaped the corner of her eye, tracing a clean line down her dusty cheek. "Arthur," she whispered, her voice fragile and exhausted. "Mom," Arthur choked out, the title slipping from the chief of police's lips and shattering the tense atmosphere of the parking lot. A collective, audible gasp rippled through the crowd of bystanders. Greg Miller lowered his phone for a fraction of a second, his jaw dropping open. Sarah Jenkins covered her mouth with both hands. "Mom." The arrogant rookie hadn't just arrested a random grandmother. He had violently cuffed the mother of the most powerful law enforcement officer in the county. Arthur fell to his knees on the burning asphalt. He leaned into the sweltering back seat, his massive, trembling hands reaching for her wrists. "I've got you, Mom. I've got you. Hold still." He fumbled with the handcuff key, his vision blurring. The metal bracelets had bitten deep into Beatrice's delicate skin, leaving angry, purple welts. As the cuffs clicked open and fell away, Beatrice let out a sharp cry of agony, her left arm dropping lifelessly to her side. The rotator cuff was severely strained. "My shoulder, baby," she whimpered, leaning forward into Arthur's embrace. He was so rough. Arthur wrapped his arms around her, burying his face in her silver hair, entirely uncaring of the 30 smartphones recording his every move. For 30 seconds, he wasn't the chief of police. He was the scared 14-year-old foster kid who had just watched someone hurt the only mother who had ever loved him. He helped her gently slide out of the vehicle, supporting her weight as she stood on trembling legs. Once Beatrice was safely leaning against the cool exterior of his unmarked interceptor, Arthur stood up to his full height. The vulnerability vanished. The sun retreated, and the chief of police returned, bringing with him a terrifying wrath. He turned slowly to face Officer Harrison, who was now visibly shaking, his face the color of wet ash. Harrison looked like he wanted the asphalt to open up and swallow him whole. "Chief, I didn't know," Harrison stammered, raising his hands defensively. "The car matched the description, a brown 70s sedan. She was resisting. I followed protocol, sir. I was just doing my job." Arthur closed the distance between them in 3 massive strides. "You didn't know?" Arthur's voice was a lethal whisper. "You didn't run the plates. You didn't check the registration. You ignored a bolo description for a rusted Chevy and assaulted an elderly woman over an immaculate Mercedes. Sir, the situation was dynamic." "Shut your mouth!" Arthur roared, the sound echoing off the brick walls of the grocery store like a thunderclap. Harrison flinched violently. "You threw a 72-year-old woman against a burning car. You cuffed her behind her back and locked her in a 90-degree cruiser without ventilation. You didn't do police work today, Harrison. You engaged in armed thuggery." "Chief, please," Harrison begged, his eyes darting to the crowd, realizing his entire career was dissolving in real time. "Give me your badge," Arthur demanded, holding out an open palm. "Sir, you can't do this here. The Union—" "I said give me your badge, your weapon, and your radio, right now. You are stripped of your police powers, effective immediately. You are suspended without pay. You will not drive that cruiser back to the precinct. You will walk, or you will call a cab. But if you ever lay a hand on another citizen in my city, I will personally see you thrown into a federal penitentiary. Do you understand me?" Harrison's fingers trembled as he unpinned the silver shield from his chest and unbuckled his heavy-duty belt, handing them over to his commanding officer in front of the cheering crowd. It was the ultimate, devastating public humiliation. Arthur took the gear, turned his back on the disgraced rookie, and walked back to his mother. He carefully helped Beatrice into the passenger seat of his air-conditioned Interceptor, clicked her seatbelt into place, and drove her straight to the Marietta General Hospital, leaving Officer Todd Harrison standing alone, stripped of his authority, in the middle of the grocery store parking lot. The emergency room at Marietta General was a sanctuary of cool air and quiet efficiency. Paramedics Chloe and Jackson, who knew Arthur well, rushed Beatrice into a private trauma bay. X-rays confirmed Arthur's worst fears, a severe dislocation and a micro tear in the rotator cuff, an injury that would require months of agonizing physical therapy for a woman of Beatrice's age. As the doctor fitted her arm into a rigid blue sling, Arthur stood in the corner of the room, his fists clenched so tight his fingernails drew blood from his own palms. "Stop pacing, Arthur, you're making me dizzy," Beatrice scolded gently, taking a sip of ice water. Even battered and bruised, her voice retained the calm, authoritative cadence of a seasoned educator. "I'm going to destroy him, Mom," Arthur said, his voice thick with guilt. "I put that uniform on his back. I signed his transfer papers. My department did this to you." "Your department did not do this. A frightened, arrogant boy did this," Beatrice corrected him, resting her good hand on the hospital bed rails. "Do not let anger cloud your judgment, Arthur. You are the chief. Act like one. The truth will do the punishing for you." Beatrice's words were prophetic because, while she was resting in the hospital, the digital world was erupting. Greg Miller hadn't just recorded the video. He had uploaded the entire unedited 12-minute saga to YouTube, TikTok, and X, formerly Twitter, before he even left the Fresh Market parking lot. He titled it, "Rookie Cop Assaults Grandma Over Her Own Car. Then the Police Chief Arrives. Must Watch." The algorithm caught it like a dry forest catching a spark. Within 2 hours, the video crossed 1 million views. By nightfall, it was at 10 million. The footage was perfectly framing the modern zeitgeist, the sheer absurdity of the officer's initial aggression. Beatrice's eloquent and calm defense, the crushing realization of the mistake, and finally, the cinematic arrival of Chief Mitchell. The moment Arthur uttered the word "Mom" became the most clipped, shared, and reacted to piece of media on the internet. National news networks descended upon Marietta. CNN, Fox, and MSNBC all had satellite trucks parked outside the police precinct by dawn on Wednesday. The narrative was inescapable, but unlike most viral police encounters that ended in tragedy and ambiguous debates, this one had a clear villain and a cinematic hero. However, in the shadows, a desperate counter-offensive was brewing. Todd Harrison, realizing his life was over, contacted Richard Gannon, a notorious police union attorney known for his ruthless, scorched earth tactics. Gannon knew he couldn't win in the court of public opinion, but he could try to muddy the waters enough to save Harrison's pension and avoid criminal charges. On Thursday morning, a leaked statement appeared in a sympathetic local blog. It read, "Officer Harrison was operating under high-stress conditions. The suspect, Mrs. Washington, refused lawful orders and made furtive movements toward a bag that could have contained a weapon. The chief of police's emotional and unprofessional intervention compromised a lawful arrest and violated department protocol." When Arthur read the article in his office, his jaw locked. He had intentionally recused himself from the formal internal affairs investigation to prevent Gannon from claiming bias, handing the reins to the State Bureau of Investigation, SBI. But this leak was a direct attack on his mother's character. Before Arthur could issue a fiery rebuttal, his phone buzzed. It was Beatrice. "Did you see the article?" Arthur asked, gripping the receiver. "I did," Beatrice replied calmly. "I want you to call a press conference, Arthur, for tomorrow morning. It's time I spoke to my community. Mum, you don't have to do this. You're injured. The SBI is handling it." "Arthur," she said, utilizing the exact tone she used when he brought home a C- in algebra 30 years ago. "I taught history for 35 years. I know what happens when you let someone else write your narrative. Book the town hall. I have something to say." While Beatrice prepared her statement, Arthur could not shake a nagging suspicion. He sat in his darkened office long after the precinct had emptied out, the blue glow of his computer monitor illuminating his tired face. He kept asking himself one question: how did Todd Harrison get a badge in my department? Arthur was a stickler for recruitment. He demanded psychological evaluations, deep background checks, and extensive de-escalation training. Harrison had transferred laterally from Oconee County, a rural jurisdiction 3 hours south, just a few months prior. Arthur pulled up Harrison's digital personnel file. The transfer paperwork had been expedited and signed by William Cobb, the former deputy chief, who Arthur had forced into early retirement last year due to philosophical differences. Cobb was an old-school, good old boy cop who believed fear was a better tool than community outreach. Arthur dug deeper, bypassing the standard HR files and logging into the statewide internal affairs database using his executive clearance. He searched for Todd Harrison's name in Oconee County. The screen populated, and Arthur's blood ran cold. There were 3 separate complaints filed against Harrison in the last 2 years. One for excessive force during a traffic stop involving a Hispanic teenager. One for drawing his weapon on an unarmed man experiencing a mental health crisis. And one for falsifying a police report to cover up an unlawful search. All 3 complaints had been flagged unsubstantiated and quietly buried. Arthur cross-referenced the names. The sheriff of Oconee County was a man named Dale Harrison, Todd's uncle. Furthermore, William Cobb and Dale Harrison had attended the FBI National Academy together in the late 90s. It was a classic, sickening case of the buddy system. A dangerous, unstable rookie was protected by his family, And when the complaints started piling up, the uncle called in a favor to Cobb to transfer the problem out of his county and into Arthur's lap. The system hadn't just failed Beatrice, it had actively conspired to put a predator in her path. The next morning, the Marietta Town Hall was packed to absolute capacity. Over 400 citizens crammed into the pews, while dozens of reporters set up a wall of cameras in the back. The air hummed with electricity and outrage. Arthur stood at the podium, looking out over the sea of faces. He didn't wear his dress uniform. He wore a simple suit, standing not just as a chief, but as a son and a citizen. "Ladies and gentlemen," Arthur began, his voice echoing through the grand hall. 3 days ago, a catastrophic failure of training, empathy, and common sense occurred in our city. Many of you watched it online. Many of you are angry. You should be. He paused, letting the silence settle. But the failure goes deeper than one officer making a terrible choice. Last night, I discovered that Officer Todd Harrison's transfer to this department was orchestrated to hide a history of excessive force in another jurisdiction. A wave of shocked murmurs rolled through the crowd. Richard Gannon, sitting in the front row, suddenly looked very pale. The men who facilitated this cover-up, former Deputy Chief William Cobb and Oconee County Sheriff Dale Harrison, will be formally investigated by the State Attorney General, effective this morning, Arthur announced, dropping a bombshell that sent reporters scrambling for their phones. We cannot police our communities if we cannot police ourselves. But I am not here today to speak about the perpetrators. I am here to yield the floor to the victim, my mother. The crowd erupted into a standing ovation as Beatrice Washington walked slowly onto the stage. She wore a beautiful emerald green dress, the blue medical sling stark against the vibrant fabric. She moved with a dignified, unhurried grace, stepping up to the microphone. She looked out at the flashing cameras and the angry faces, and she didn't project rage. She projected profound, unshakable authority. "When I was a young woman," Beatrice began, her voice steady and clear, commanding the room, just as she had commanded her classrooms. "I marched from Selma to Montgomery. I was spat on, I was threatened, and I was told that my life had less value because of the color of my skin. I fought so that my children and my students would not have to face the indignities of a prejudiced system." The room was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. "When that young man put his hands on me," she continued, "I was not afraid for myself. I have lived a long, full life. I was terrified for the young men and women who do not have a police chief for a son. I was terrified for the teenager who might have panicked. I was terrified for the deaf citizen who might not have heard his commands. A badge is a sacred trust. It is a shield for the vulnerable, not a weapon for the insecure." She looked directly down at Richard Gannon. "I am not interested in vengeance," Beatrice stated firmly. "Vengeance does not build communities. I am interested in reform. Firing one frightened boy will not fix the soil that grew him. Therefore, I am formally demanding that this city implement a mandatory, independent oversight committee for all lateral police transfers. And I am demanding that all officers in this county undergo rigorous, quarterly training on elder interactions and de-escalation, governed by civilian review." She took a breath, offering a small, sad smile. "My husband bought me that beautiful brown car in 1972. He worked his fingers to the bone for it. That car represents the American dream we built together. No one, absolutely no one, has the right to strip a citizen of their dignity on a Tuesday morning while they are simply trying to buy peaches for their family." The fallout from Beatrice Washington's speech was seismic. It shifted the narrative from a fleeting viral outrage into a massive, organized movement for concrete legislative change. The State Bureau of Investigation moved with unprecedented speed. Within 48 hours of the town hall, Todd Harrison was officially terminated from the Marietta Police Department. But Arthur Mitchell didn't stop there. He pushed the Peace Officer Standards and Training Post Council for a full revocation of Harrison's law enforcement certification. Faced with undeniable video evidence and a national spotlight, Post stripped Harrison of his credentials. He would never legally be allowed to carry a badge or a gun in the United States again. The corruption probe Arthur initiated ripped through the old boy network. Former Deputy Chief William Cobb was indicted for official misconduct and fraud, his pension frozen. The Oconee County Sheriff faced a massive recall election, funded by outraged citizens, effectively ending his political dynasty. Richard Gannon, the union lawyer, quietly dropped Harrison as a client, realizing the case was toxic to his firm's reputation. Harrison faded into obscurity, moving out of state in disgrace, a cautionary tale of unchecked ego and implicit bias. 6 months later, the Marietta City Council formally passed the Washington Protocols. It was a sweeping set of police reforms that mandated civilian oversight for lateral transfers, instituted mandatory psychological re-evaluations every 2 years, and created a specialized unit trained specifically in geriatric and mental health crises. Arthur stood right beside the mayor as the legislation was signed, but the pen was ultimately handed to Beatrice, who signed her name with a flourish. Her right shoulder finally healed enough to write. It was a crisp autumn morning when Beatrice walked out of her front door, the air smelling of pine and distant wood smoke. She wore a warm cashmere sweater and her favorite pearl earrings. Waiting for her in the driveway was Arthur. He was off duty, wearing jeans and a simple Henley shirt. In his hands, he held a set of keys. Parked behind him was the 1972 Mercedes-Benz 280 SE. The tobacco-brown paint gleamed perfectly in the morning light. After the incident, the car had been sent to a luxury body shop. The dent in the trunk where Beatrice had been shoved was flawlessly repaired, the chrome polished to a mirror shine. Arthur walked over and opened the heavy driver's side door for his mother. "You ready to go to the store, Mum?" he asked, a warm smile breaking across his face. Beatrice ran her fingers over the smooth leather steering wheel, the memories of her husband rushing back, uncorrupted by the violence of that summer day. She looked at her son, the boy she had chosen, the man who had torn down a corrupt system just to keep her safe. "I am, sweetheart," Beatrice smiled, sliding into the seat. "And Arthur?" "Yes, Mom?" "I think I'll make an apple pie this time. Peaches are out of season." Arthur laughed, a deep, resonant sound that echoed through the peaceful neighborhood. He closed her door with a solid thud, walking around to the passenger side. Beatrice turned the key. The classic German engine roared to life, a powerful, unyielding sound. She put the car in reverse, backing out of the driveway with the supreme confidence of a woman who knew exactly who she was, where she was going, and that nothing, no fear, no badge, and no broken system would ever stand in her way again. What began as a terrifying display of unchecked authority and ego transformed into a masterclass on dignity, accountability, and the unbreakable bond between a mother and her son. Beatrice Washington didn't just survive a nightmare. She used her voice to rewrite the rules, ensuring no one else would ever suffer the same indignity. Her grace dismantled a corrupt system from the inside out. If this incredible true story of justice, family, and reform inspired you, please hit that like button, share this video to keep Beatrice's powerful message alive, and subscribe to our channel for more unforgettable, real-life dramas.